It was supposed to be a routine guest appearance. Denzel Washington, Hollywood legend and two-time Academy Award winner, was booked on The View to promote his upcoming film and share thoughts on leadership, values, and integrity. But from the moment he sat down on the stage, something felt off. Sunny Hostin, known for her pointed political takes, opened with a question that seemed loaded from the start. Denzel, you've built your career on being a role model, but how do you reconcile that with supporting institutions that many people, especially in marginalized communities, feel have betrayed them? The audience grew still. Denzel blinked once, then leaned forward. Are you asking if I'm allowed to support my country and my faith, because others have failed to live up to their calling? Sunny smirked slightly. I'm just saying it sends a mixed message when people see someone like you uplifting systems they believe have harmed them. Denzel looked down, his hands folded. He nodded slowly. Then he looked up. And that's when the room changed. The silence in the studio felt electric. Denzel Washington's eyes were calm, but intense, like a man who had spent years thinking deeply about the question he'd just been asked. He took a breath and spoke, not loud, not angry, but with quiet steel in his voice. Let me tell you something, Sonny. I've seen what real betrayal looks like. I've seen it in Hollywood. I've seen it in politics. But I've also seen what honor looks like, in police officers, in soldiers, in pastors, in teachers, people who show up every day and do the right thing when no one's watching. Sunny leaned back slightly, surprised by the shift in tone. Denzel didn't blink. You don't get to put me in a box. I'm not a mouthpiece for your politics. I'm not here to echo whatever's trending on Twitter. I'm here because I believe in personal responsibility, in discipline, and in truth. Not the kind you curate, but the kind you live. A stunned hush fell across the panel. Joy Behar adjusted her glasses, clearly unsure how to pivot. Whoopi Goldberg opened her mouth, then closed it again. But Sunny Hostin pressed forward, her voice slightly tighter. So, you're saying there's no problem with the system? That people are just imagining injustice? Denzel finally sat back in his chair, jaw tight now. He spoke just 5 words, but they cut like a blade. I've had enough of this. The audience gasped. The studio air turned thick with tension. Denzel's words, I've had enough of this, still echoed in the space. Even the camera crew seemed frozen, unsure whether to pan, cut, or zoom. Sunny Hostin's face stiffened. She leaned forward again, as if trying to regain control of the narrative. Denzel, no one's attacking you. But with your platform, don't you think you have a responsibility to speak out against systemic problems? Remaining silent can be seen as complicity. Denzel turned toward her slowly. Silence. You think I've been silent? He shook his head, a small, almost incredulous laugh escaping. I've spoken through every role I've taken. Through the way I carry myself as a man, as a father, as a black man who refuses to be defined by victimhood or guilt-tripping narratives. He paused, letting the weight of that land. And let me say this clearly, standing for values, for structure, for order, that doesn't mean I deny injustice. It means I don't glorify chaos. I've seen what happens when we tear everything down instead of building better. Whoopi finally spoke up, cautiously. Denzel, I think what Sunny's trying to say is, he raised a hand gently, but firmly. With all respect, Whoopi, let me finish. Gasps. No one interrupted Whoopi on The View. No one. You could hear a pin drop. Even the notoriously outspoken Joy Behar seemed frozen in place as Denzel Washington kept his eyes on Whoopi, not in anger, but with the unwavering conviction of a man who wasn't going to be steamrolled. I came here to talk about a film. A film about redemption. About strength. About character. And somehow, it turned into an interrogation because I don't fit into a neat ideological box. He turned back to Sunny Hostin. You want me to denounce the system? Fine. I'll denounce any system that breaks people down. Corruption, greed, lies, I've seen it in government. In corporations. In the church. But I won't sit here and pretend that everything is broken just because it's popular to say so. Sonny tried to respond, but he wasn't done. You think it's brave to tear things down on TV? Try mentoring kids who've been told they'll never be more than a statistic. Try showing up for people with no cameras, no applause. That's where change begins, not in slogans, but in sacrifice. The live audience erupted in spontaneous applause. A few even stood up. Denzel didn't smile. He didn't grandstand. He just leaned back in his seat, composed. For the first time that morning, Sunny Hostin looked rattled. Well, she said, voice clipped, I didn't mean to offend. Denzel shook his head. I'm not offended. I'm just no longer willing to be polite about truth. Sunny Hostin adjusted the stack of cards in front of her, suddenly looking more like a student caught off guard than a seasoned TV host. Joy Behar opened her mouth, clearly preparing a deflection, but even she seemed unsure how to proceed. The audience remained captivated, phones were out, silently recording what had just become one of the View's most unforgettable moments. Denzel turned slightly in his chair, addressing not just the panel but the viewers watching across the country. We keep having the same conversation over and over. Outrage without solutions. Division masquerading as dialogue. It's like a merry-go-round of blame with no brakes. He paused, letting the silence carry his next point. You want real change? Start with yourself. Your household. Your work ethic. Your discipline. You don't get to burn the house down because the roof leaks. Whoopi finally spoke, quieter this time. So what's the answer, Denzel? If not protest, if not disruption, then what? He didn't hesitate. Principle. Legacy. Mentorship. And yes, faith. Things we used to value before outrage became a brand. Another wave of applause rose from the audience. Denzel stood up slowly, signaling he was done. I didn't come here to fight. But I also didn't come here to be lectured. He turned to Sunny, calm and unwavering. So with all due respect, don't mistake my silence for surrender. I speak when it matters. Without another word, he gave a courteous nod and walked off stage. The camera stayed on the stunned faces of the hosts. Backstage, the crew scrambled to adjust the live feed. Producers spoke rapidly into headsets, unsure whether to cut to commercial or ride the media storm that was unfolding in real time. Meanwhile, on stage, a long silence followed Denzel's exit. It wasn't just awkward, it was historic. Sunny Hostin stared ahead, her face a mix of frustration and disbelief. She had just tried to confront one of America's most respected cultural icons, and walked straight into a wall of calm, unapologetic wisdom. Joy Behar cleared her throat. Well, that was unexpected. Whoopi leaned forward, elbows on the table, her tone measured. Look, we invite strong voices to this table. And whether we agree or not, Denzel made his position clear. He believes in order. He believes in discipline. And he clearly doesn't care about fitting anyone's mold. Sunny finally spoke, trying to regain control. I just asked a question. If we can't ask questions, then what are we doing here? A few members of the audience groaned quietly. Sarah Haynes, who had been silent through most of the confrontation, finally added her thoughts. Sunny, there's a difference between asking questions and making assumptions. You asked if Denzel was sending a mixed message just for having faith in institutions. That's a loaded question, and he called it out. Sunny sat back, eyes narrowing. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the director whispered a countdown to commercial. Back in 60, someone said off camera. But the damage, or the breakthrough, depending on perspective, had already been done. As the show returned from commercial, the energy on set had shifted. Gone was the usual banter and choreographed laughter. What remained was the weight of what had just happened, a rare, unscripted moment where a guest had taken control, spoken his truth, and walked away without apology. Whoopi Goldberg addressed the audience first. "Alright, welcome back. For those just tuning in, we had Denzel Washington with us earlier. Things got passionate. A few audience members chuckled nervously. Whoopi continued. Whether you agreed with him or not, he reminded us of something we don't always get on daytime television, conviction. A man who speaks from his soul, not from a script." Joy Behar tried to lighten the mood. "Well, it's not every day you get dressed down by Malcolm X." Some laughter. Even Sunny cracked a forced smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She looked into the camera. "Let me be clear. I respect Denzel Washington. But I still believe in asking the tough questions. I won't apologize for that." Sarah Haynes gently interjected. "No one's asking for an apology. But sometimes, Sunny, it's not about asking questions, it's about listening to the answers." The audience murmured in agreement. There was an unspoken truth hanging in the air. Denzel hadn't just spoken to them, he had spoken to America. And America was listening. Later that day, clips from The View went viral. Denzel's calm but forceful pushback. Sunny's pointed question. The moment he stood up and declared, "I've had enough of this." Within hours, the hashtag #DenzelSpeaks was trending worldwide. Some praised him for speaking truth in an era of noise. Others accused him of sidestepping systemic issues. But everyone agreed on one thing: he hadn't backed down. On conservative talk radio, he was hailed as a hero. On liberal podcasts, reactions were more mixed, but even there, grudging respect emerged for the way he carried himself with discipline and purpose. By evening, cable news had picked it up. Tucker Carlson called it a masterclass in masculine integrity. Don Lemon said, "You can disagree with Denzel, but you can't deny that he believes what he says, and he says it with clarity." Even Oprah was asked for a comment at a charity gala. She paused, smiled, and simply said, "Denzel doesn't raise his voice. He raises the room." Back on The View, producers debated whether to invite Denzel back for a follow-up. But a handwritten note was already sitting on the executive producer's desk, no signature, just 4 words, "No interest." "I'm done." The fallout continued over the next few days. Media outlets replayed the segment on loop. Headlines swirled: Denzel shocks The View with unfiltered truth, Hollywood icon clashes with Hostin over patriotism and faith, Denzel walks off, leaves legacy behind. Behind the scenes, Sunny Hostin felt the pressure. Social media wasn't kind. Some praised her for challenging power, but many criticized her tone, accusing her of trying to trap a man who had earned the nation's respect through decades of integrity, both on screen and off. She addressed it briefly on Instagram Live. "Look, I have no regrets asking tough questions. That's what journalists do. But I also respect Denzel. He's not just a celebrity, he's a cultural voice. I may not agree with him on everything, but I'll never silence someone willing to speak from the heart." Meanwhile, Denzel stayed silent. No tweets. No press appearances. No public comments. But he didn't have to say a word, the world was still talking. At a private event in D.C. days later, he was seen talking quietly with a group of young men from underserved communities. No cameras. No speeches. Just presence. One attendee tweeted anonymously, "Denzel said more in 5 minutes than most leaders say in 5 years. No hype. Just wisdom." It was clear, Denzel Washington hadn't just ended a segment. He had started a conversation. Back at ABC headquarters, The View's producers huddled for a rare weekend strategy meeting. Ratings had surged, but not for the reasons they preferred. The Denzel moment had cracked open something raw and real in the American psyche. Audiences weren't tuning in for the usual celebrity gossip anymore. They wanted authenticity, courage, purpose. And they weren't sure The View could deliver that again. A young producer finally spoke up. "We've had presidents, candidates, Nobel winners. But Denzel, he came in and changed the temperature of the room without yelling once. That's rare power." The executive producer nodded slowly. "It was real. And people miss real. We've been giving them commentary. He gave them clarity." Meanwhile, Denzel remained out of the spotlight, but not off the grid. A photo surfaced online showing him at a community center in Baltimore, standing with a group of veterans, all in casual clothes. No speech, no spotlight. Just a hand on a shoulder, a quiet word exchanged. Someone in the comments wrote, "He didn't need a mic. The man is the message." Meanwhile, Sunny Hostin received a formal letter from her alma mater. A professor had nominated her to lead a campus discussion on race, media, and accountability, using her exchange with Denzel as the case study. She hesitated. Part of her felt exposed. Part of her felt challenged. And part of her, deep down, felt changed. Because no matter how she spun it, Denzel had held up a mirror. And it was still reflecting. A week later, the public conversation hadn't died down, it had only deepened. Colleges were now assigning transcripts of the Denzel Washington, The View exchange in media ethics classes. Pundits continued dissecting the moment on Sunday panels, and churches across the country quoted his words in sermons about truth and personal responsibility. Yet Denzel kept a deliberate silence. That is, until one unexpected Sunday. He appeared unannounced at a youth leadership summit in Atlanta, no press, no entourage, just him. Word spread fast, and by the time he took the small stage in the auditorium, it was standing room only. He looked out at the crowd, most of them under 30. "I've said enough on TV," he began. "Now let me say something where it counts." The room went still. "You're not weak if you speak calmly. You're not wrong if you challenge the noise. And you're not powerless if you build instead of burn." The crowd leaned in. "We don't need more outrage. We need more men and women of weight. People who don't just clap back, but stand up. People who don't follow the moment, they anchor it." He ended with a brief nod. "You don't need a platform to have impact. You just need to be someone who keeps showing up, even when the world misunderstands you." Thunderous applause followed, but he didn't stay to bask in it. He walked off stage the same way he'd walked off The View. Quiet. Centered. Unshaken. Back in New York, The View was still grappling with the aftershock. Ratings remained high, but something had shifted. Viewers were demanding more than sound bites. The tone of the show, once quick to provoke, slow to reflect, now felt outdated in a post-Denzel moment. Sunny Hostin sat in her dressing room, staring at a draft of her upcoming book manuscript. She picked up a pen and crossed out a full chapter. "I was writing for applause," she whispered to herself, "not for truth." For the first time in her career, she realized what Denzel had done wasn't just about shutting down a line of questioning. He had issued a challenge, one that extended far beyond the set of a talk show. It was about courage. The kind that doesn't yell. The kind that doesn't conform. The kind that risks being misunderstood for the sake of saying something that matters. In a rare tweet, Denzel broke his silence days later. It read simply, "Legacy of likes. Truth trend. Character clout." The post amassed millions of likes in hours. From the halls of Congress to barbershops in Detroit, his words were being quoted. Discussed. Printed on posters. Framed in classrooms. He hadn't just shut down Sunny Hostin. He had awakened a country dulled by noise. By the time a major Sunday news program invited Denzel Washington for a primetime special called The Conversation America Needed, the impact of his moment on The View had become cultural canon. But Denzel declined the invitation. Instead, he released a short video online, just him, sitting on a wooden stool in a quiet room. No background music. No fancy edits. "I didn't walk off that show because I was angry," he said. "I walked off because the truth doesn't need to be shouted over. I said my piece, and I let it stand. That's something this country used to understand." He looked directly into the camera. "We're addicted to outrage. We confuse interruption with courage. We've forgotten how to sit still and listen, not just to others, but to ourselves." He smiled faintly. "You don't change a nation by trending. You change it by building. Brick by brick. Heart by heart." The video ended. No logo. No plug. Just silence. And it was that silence that echoed loudest. Back on The View, Sunny Hostin sat at the panel table weeks later. A new guest brought up the Denzel moment, trying to reignite the debate. But this time, Sunny raised a hand, not to challenge, but to acknowledge. "I learned something from that day," she said. "Sometimes the strongest voices are the ones that don't raise themselves, but raise others." The audience applauded, not wildly, but respectfully. Something had changed. Not just in the show, but in the conversation itself. Months later, the ripples of Denzel Washington's appearance were still being felt, not in headlines anymore, but in subtler, more profound ways. In classrooms, teachers referenced his words during civics lessons. In community centers, mentors quoted him when speaking to young men about discipline and dignity. Even in Hollywood, a shift was quietly happening. Actors, directors, and writers were beginning to speak more openly about substance over spectacle, legacy over momentary fame. And at home, in living rooms across the country, families had conversations they hadn't had in years. Fathers played back his speech at the youth summit. Mothers nodded quietly when he said, "You don't need a platform to have impact." Denzel had become more than a celebrity moment, he had become a cultural mirror. And in that reflection, people saw both the fractures and the foundations that still held. As for Sunny Hostin, she continued her work on The View, but her tone had evolved. More measured. More introspective. She even invited a group of youth leaders onto the show to talk about how they were building change, not online, but in real life. And though Denzel never returned to the studio, his presence lingered like a watermark, clear, permanent, impossible to ignore. One day, a card arrived at ABC Studios. No signature. Just a quote printed on heavy parchment paper, "When the dust settles, character stands." Sunny held the card for a long time. She knew exactly who it was from. Spring arrived in New York, and with it came the launch of a nationwide youth initiative called Stand Quiet, Stand Strong. The campaign focused on mentorship, civic leadership, and personal responsibility. It didn't have corporate sponsors or flashy marketing, but it had something more powerful, a quiet endorsement from Denzel Washington. Though his name wasn't on the website, everyone knew he was behind it. Photos surfaced of him visiting inner-city schools, funding trade programs, and meeting with young fathers behind the scenes. He didn't sit on panels. He sat beside people. Meanwhile, The View shifted in tone over time. The producers introduced a new segment called Moments That Matter, dedicated to guests who were building, not branding. And one morning, unannounced, a letter was read live on air. Whoopi held it in her hand, voice steady. "To those with platforms, use them wisely. To those without, know that your impact is still immeasurable. Speak less often. Mean more when you do. DW." A hush fell over the studio. Sunny Hostin lowered her eyes, and smiled, just slightly. That moment, quiet, humble, unforced, carried more gravity than any debate ever could. Because in an era where so many shouted to be heard, one man reminded the world that strength is not in volume, it's in virtue.